welcome to all of our friends and colleagues around the globe joining us for this webinar series on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Today's topic is decentering alcohol and recentering values and professional development, inclusive practices in higher education. We are so fortunate today to have with us Brooke and Saiqa, who have put together some wonderful presentations to deliver some meaningful content and are prepared to answer your questions as we engage in an impactful discussion. Brooke is an attorney and founder of Tiny Adventures Path. She helps organizations like ours shift their culture related to alcohol to create well-being, inclusion, and healthier employees. Brooke draws upon lessons from a well-being crisis as well as tools from her own recovery. She founded the Tiny Adventures social group, which is alcohol-free, in Richmond, Virginia, and they have over 450 members, and she has organized over 100 events through this organization. She also supports law school programming for the Institute for Wellbeing and Law, and she serves as vice chair for the DEIB committee for the ABA Law Practice Group. She is a graduate of the University of Virginia School of Law and Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. Then we have our very own Saiqa, who is a highly sought after speaker, trainer, editor, and writer. She has over 15 years of experience in higher education management in both the US and Europe, and holds both an MBA and a PhD. She is an advocate for data-driven decision-making, as you will soon see in her presentation. And she is also an Incura traveling faculty member and formerly a member of our very own SCDEI. She has also served as an adjunct faculty at Johns Hopkins University. So before we get into the content, I wanted to give a little backstory for what brought us here to today's webinar. In 2018, I was on the Committee for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for Incura's Region 3. And as we were preparing for our spring meeting, we were discussing ways that we could create an inclusive experience for all attendees. And the topic of alcohol came up. And I was so surprised, and it struck me very profoundly, because I have friends and family members that struggle with alcoholism and that are in active recovery. But I never thought about what their experience has been attending professional events where there is so much alcohol offered. After going through this experience, I really thought about it throughout the years. And so when I had an opportunity to write an article for the Incura magazine, I thought about this topic. And as I was researching for the article, I stumbled upon Brooke's article. And everything that she said resonated so deeply with me that I was moved to reach out to her and ask if we could engage in a conversation. And she met with myself and Lamar Oglesby, who is the current chair of SCDEI. And as we were talking about the topic, we realized it would be a wonderful webinar. So that's what got us here to have this webinar. And we were also fortunate enough to know that Saiqa has been engaged in this work as well. And there was a lot of synchronicity and alignment of our passion on this topic. And so I'm very excited, and you are in for a treat. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Brooke, who will take us through her presentation.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm so happy to be here with you today. My name is Brooke Welch, and as Tanya said, I help organizations shift their culture around alcohol to create well-being, inclusion, and healthier employees. And thank you so much to Tanya, Latasha, and Lamar is somewhere here, and Incura for inviting me to speak with you today about an under-recognized issue that impacts diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And specifically, how a surprising spectrum of our valued colleagues are excluded or mask their authentic selves when relationship building is centered around alcohol, and how that impacts professional development opportunities. So from my experience, there's simply a lack of awareness about this issue. Connecting through alcohol is embedded in so many of our professional cultures. And the current status quo for so many organizations is to default to centering social events, especially those in the evening around alcohol. The typical event has one bar and often displays the beer and wine choices. And not infrequently, events are hosted at breweries and vineyards. And perhaps the event is even called a wine tasting or bowling and brewery or something to that effect. But you may not have noticed who isn't drinking or who is pretending to drink or who simply did not come. Or you may not have thought about it when you asked a new employee or a mentee to get a drink. Or you casually asked a colleague why they aren't drinking at an event. On a positive note, many organizations are starting to offer alcohol-free options and alternatives, but they don't quite go far enough frequently. And this is because they don't really understand the why around it, which for me is about inclusion, professional opportunities, and our health. And so we need to start with awareness and then move towards action. And there are concrete ways that we can create a more inclusive culture, which I'll talk about, and my colleague Saiqa will also talk about. So today, I'll use my personal experience and research to cover 3 learning objectives. The first is to identify the diverse spectrum of non-drinkers. The second is to understand the impact on psychological safety and professional success. And the third is to learn pragmatic ways to create inclusive events that support those who choose not to drink. And so I'd like to start off with a personal story. As Tanya kind of referred to, I am in recovery for alcohol use disorder, which is commonly known as alcoholism. I actually celebrated 16 years of sobriety last week. And today, I am open with my recovery. Oh, thank you. But that's not always been the case. You know, in fact, I kept it private for many years, particularly in my profession and workplace. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. But one afternoon, several years ago, I attended a monthly all-staff meeting. And to my surprise, the director announced that she had a special treat for us. Instead of our normal meeting, we'd be doing a happy hour down the street at Max's Tap Room. Now, I'd been sober for at least 6 years. I was not in early recovery, and I developed a certain comfort level with alcohol, but I usually would plan and spiritually prepare. And so with this spontaneous event, I was thrown off guard. But I really valued my colleagues and I wanted to spend time with them. I wanted to be part of the team. And so I walked down to Max's Tap Room. I even sat down at the table, but then I started to take in the atmosphere. Beer taps lined the walls, a huge beer menu. People started talking about which beer they were going to order. And I froze. I felt anxious and I just knew I had to get out of there. And so I kind of abruptly got up from the table and said I had to go. My colleagues were really confused, but I just took off. So on my walk back, I ran right into my supervisor and the director. They were surprised and said, "You're walking the wrong way." And so I lied. I said I forgot something at the office and I'd be back. And so I did go back to the office and I sat at my desk. I didn't know what to do. I felt anxious. I felt excluded. I felt scared of offending the director. And I was disappointed not to spend time with my colleagues and be part of the fun. And I'll tell you the rest of the story later in the presentation, but here's a point. The director was trying to do something generous for our team. It was not her intention to exclude me or make me feel uncomfortable. It didn't occur to her to consider the impact on non-drinkers. But I did miss that opportunity to nurture connections with my colleagues and have FaceTime with the director. And so let's start with the first objective, which is to identify the spectrum of non-drinkers. First of all, let's acknowledge that a lot of people drink, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that. I am not espousing a temperance movement or removing alcohol from all social events. According to the NIH, about 62% of Americans have had an alcoholic drink in the last year. But a recent survey by Gallup showed that 74% of college-educated people drink alcohol, and the number further increases to 78% among college-educated high-income earners. So that's an interesting cultural and professional phenomenon, isn't it? So it's not unusual if the majority of Incura members drink alcohol and feel comfortable and even seek social events with alcohol. And it's not surprising if you've never noticed the diverse spectrum of non-drinkers. But who are we leaving out? Who feels uncomfortable and feels like they don't belong? With DEIB efforts, we bring intentionality around including and promoting underrepresented groups. And so anywhere from 22%, if you start with college-educated high-income earners, to 38% of normal Americans, that's how many people of Incura's membership does not drink. So I learned about the diversity of non-drinkers through my personal experience. I started an alcohol-free social meetup group in Richmond, Virginia, as Tanya was talking about, when I moved there 4 years ago. And it's called Tiny Adventures Social RVA. RVA is an abbreviation for Richmond. I love new experiences and connections, which I call tiny adventures. And so I wanted to meet people and make friends in this new city. And I thought it would be a fantastic way to have fun with other people in recovery for alcohol and substance abuse. But to my surprise, the folks in recovery didn't really join the group. Instead, people joined for a variety of reasons. Some people didn't drink for reasons I'll talk about in a minute. Some were trying to change their lifestyle, and others were tired of the constant focus on alcohol and social events. They just wanted to do a hike without the brewery afterwards. And so 4 years later, I can say that 450 people have chosen to join the group, and we have had well over 100 events, including hiking, walking tours, improv, food outings, and so much more. A couple weeks ago, we did a hiking day trip, and out of the 10 people who participated, I was the only person in recovery. So I'd love to do a poll now that they're going to bring up, and that is, do you know anyone who doesn't drink, including yourself? So I will go through the, we're having, a whole lot of people. Most of us know someone who doesn't drink, or you yourself doesn't drink. That's 93% of you. So I will now go through the results I've consolidated through my meetup group and research. And so we'll go to the next slide. Who is impacted? Those in alcohol use disorder and recovery, gender, religion, race, health, ability, trauma survivors, and lifestyle. It's actually a pretty long list once you put it all together in one place. And so we can go to the next slide. We've already touched upon the first one, which is alcohol use disorder and recovery. And you'll see that over 10% of Americans have alcohol use disorder at some point in their lives. This number captures the range of those abusing alcohol as well as opting for sobriety. The consequences are dire. There are 140,000 annual deaths due to alcohol. And I have to say one thing people don't necessarily understand is that it's both a physical allergy and also has a mental obsession component, which is different from other diseases. And that's why people getting sober often try to stay away from alcohol. And even people like myself who are in longer recovery may avoid it at times. We do develop different tools to attend functions with alcohol, but it's so much better when it's not even an issue, including what I'll talk about, just simply normalizing not drinking. And so the second is gender. Many women do not drink for reproductive reasons, whether it's fertility treatment, pregnancy, or nursing. But medical treatment for postpartum depression also does not mix with alcohol, which I'll discuss in a moment. There's also an increased risk of breast cancer. So those with a history of breast cancer frequently abstain from alcohol. And the next slide, religion is another reason. And so that impacts many who practice Islam, Mormonism, Christianity, and I recently discovered Rastafaris as well. And you may be familiar with Ramadan and Lent. So many people, even those who do drink within those religions, choose not to during those religious holidays. And different races have different alcohol habits. As you'll see, Caucasians drink the most and Asians drink the least. And, you know, a number of these races, Hispanic, Latino, Black or African American, and Asian, are frequently those underrepresented groups that we do try to put intentionality around for diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Now, alcohol has negative effects on a number of medical conditions for so many significant health reasons. Coronary heart disease is actually one of the #1 killers in the United States. And so this is for both physical health and mental health. There's just a wide variety of medications that do not mix with alcohol. One of the things that I noticed I was very surprised about is that there's actually a list of 27 different medications for depression that do not mix with alcohol. It's like a list this long. So some of your colleagues may traditionally drink, but they've stopped drinking for health reasons, which they may or may not be comfortable with you knowing about them. And so also, many people choose not to drink for lifestyle reasons. Interestingly, our newer generations drink less. So it's frequently those of us who are further along, Gen X and older, who are in the leadership positions who like to default to connecting with alcohol more than the younger generations. I'm sure you've heard of the sober curious movement and expanding that. It's really expanding those who, for their own health reasons or preferences or how alcohol mixes with them, don't drink. I was surprised myself when I started to talk to people about not drinking with social events, that so many people said, oh, yes, I don't drink either. That surprised me. And so finally, there is the issue of safety and trauma. You know, imagine that you're a survivor of sexual assault, which is unfortunately not a small number. 1 in 4 women experience sexual assault. And of those sexual assaults, 50% involve alcohol in some way. And so I've learned that it's not infrequent that these trauma survivors may intentionally avoid alcohol-oriented events. And in general, I think that most of us know that alcohol can decrease some of our inhibitions and make behavior change. And so the increase of risks of unsafe behavior, including increased verbal and physical aggression, can occur as a result of drinking, as well as racial microaggressions, which can further alienate and undermine relationships for underrepresented groups. So, as a review, who is impacted? This long list of people that you probably have not thought about coming together in one summarized place, which is those in recovery, gender, reproductive issues, various religions, different races have different habits. There are a number of health conditions and medications that do not mix with alcohol. Ability I'll talk about in just a little bit, but there are trauma survivors and many who just simply are making a lifestyle choice. And so I wanted to show you in Cure's commitment to DEI, the statement. It's right on the website, and it's such a thoughtful statement. And here's what's interesting, is you can see how the commitment so closely mirrors those who are impacted by a focus on alcohol for relationship building, including gender, race, religion, ability. So bringing intentionality around inclusion related to alcohol directly supports our DEIB commitments and values that cut across so many areas. I can say that for the Tiny Adventures social group, very large percentage of female Caucasians as well. So these are real numbers with 7,500 members. I can show you, Cura has about 7,500 members. So if we take a really conservative number using the rate for college-educated high-income earners, it's at least 1,500 people. If you use the US average of 38% people who don't drink, it would actually be nearly 3,000 members. You also likely have at least 750 members who have alcohol use disorder, whether they're abusing alcohol or they're in recovery. And my colleague Saiqa will be addressing how these numbers impact programming and budget considerations. So I think you might have a question. Tanya, do you have a question that you wanted to ask?
Can you elaborate a little bit more? So earlier you talked about the physical allergy and the mental obsession. And I think most people are more familiar actually with the mental obsession aspect of alcohol use disorder. So can you speak a little bit more on the physical allergy, as most of us are not aware?
Oh, sure. So for those with alcohol use disorder, frequently we actually have a different liver enzyme. And so when you actually have progressed to the point that you do have the disease of alcohol use disorder, alcoholism, your body actually processes alcohol differently than other people. And that process generally starts with the first drink that kicks in that allergy. And that's why so many people do not drink at all. That moderation, at least for those who are further along the spectrum with alcohol use disorder, generally doesn't work, at least long term. And so we are literally bodily different from other people. That's why it's considered a disease.
Thank you so much. And I just want to say that I love the way that you tied together all the people that are impacted with our commitment statement to diversity, equity, and inclusion, because it shows just how closely they correlate.
Yes, so let's move on to our second objective, since you just parlayed into that, and that is to understand the impact on psychological safety and professional opportunities. And we'll refer back again to the NCURA statement to see at the bottom that DEIB includes fair and respectful treatment, equal access to resources to support professional growth, and equitable opportunities to contribute to NCURA's success. And this is at the heart of psychological safety, as well as professional opportunity. Relationships are a key resource, both for your well-being as well as professional success. Relationships open up the possibility for mentorship and sponsorship, which lead to better assignments and visibility, which leads to promotion, as well as important leadership opportunities. And so ultimately, access equals opportunity. So what happens when access is not equitable for those who don't drink, or if people don't feel safe to be themselves? I'm going to go back to my earlier story. And as I said, I was just sitting in my office after leaving the bar, not knowing what to do and feeling really nervous. Then I got a text from my supervisor, and she said, "Where are you? You need to be here." And I knew that this event was a big deal for the director, and a regular excuse would simply not work. I'd already tried lying. And at that point in my sobriety, I rarely revealed my alcohol use disorder outside a group of trusted friends and family. But here are the words that I said in my reply: "Sometimes I can't go to bars." So with those words, I disclosed my most guarded health information. I basically told my supervisor, "I'm an alcoholic." And I knew that she would tell the director. So sure enough, on Monday, I go into the office, and the director ushered me into her office and closed the door. And she awkwardly apologized. And I awkwardly suggested holding future social events at a restaurant instead of a bar. And I have to say that on the whole, the director handled it well. And again, like, it was not her intention to create an event that would exclude people. It was her intention to be generous. But I felt vulnerable. A zone of comfort of my own anonymity was ruptured. And I had not intended to disclose this personal health information. I would have loved the opportunity to connect one-on-one with the director about my career and not my alcohol use disorder. So the risk of stigma and exclusion is a strong motivator to stay private about many reasons connected with not drinking, whether it's alcohol use disorder, disability, health diagnosis, religion, or even pregnancy. We open ourselves up to the biases and conclusions of others, even if it's unconscious. There may be questions about our competence or our commitment to work. Think about pregnancy. These biases, again, often unconscious, can impact our promotion, or we're simply reminded that we don't belong and maybe left out of other informal social events because people are defaulting to connecting through alcohol. So it's like, should we invite Brooke? Probably not, because there will be alcohol there. Instead of, maybe we can do something that would be fun and inclusive for everyone. So for me, it's alcohol use disorder. But the issue of masking and protecting our privacy cuts across the spectrum we already discussed. And so I value the perspective from Haley Moss. She is also an attorney, and she's an advocate for neurodiversity inclusion in the legal profession. She has autism. And I know that recently Ancura had it as part of the DEIB webinar series, really discussed neurodiversity as an inclusion issue. So Haley wrote this fantastic article, and I also know her personally, where she describes how social events are often overwhelming for her in terms of the stimuli and everything else. So she chooses not to drink. But she says, I don't want to tell my colleagues the way that my disability might interact with alcohol. And the pressure, she actually mentioned that it's almost every single time someone says, why aren't you drinking? Why don't you have a beer or a glass of wine with us? And she said she doesn't want her colleagues to know the pressure that she faces to be included socially and professionally at times, and that autistic people already mask or try to pass as neurotypical in work situations. And the thing is, you don't owe anybody your medical history or disability status. And so we're going to have a poll now. And I'm curious if you've ever pretended to drink at a work function or know someone who has.
So while the poll is going, I wanted to bring up one of the questions that came, because privacy and confidentiality is very important and pivotal, as you discussed. And we know that whether it's alcohol use disorder or your medical or any other thing like that, your confidentiality is important. So how would you recommend leaders and managers handling situations like yours, where an employee is put in a situation where they are forced to disclose the information to not, conform or mask?
Well, I will probably touch upon that, but my greatest solution is to normalize not drinking and to become aware of the spectrum of people who are impacted, so that, and I'll talk about this more in terms of the specific things that we can make more inclusive events, is that the more that we make it normal that people aren't drinking, the less questions arise, and shouldn't arise, because it's just not even an issue. But it's just not, it's not okay to have to disclose your health history. It's not appropriate for someone to say I'm pregnant before they want to do so. It's not appropriate for someone to have to talk about the history of breast cancer in their family. And so hopefully it doesn't arise that frequently. I don't think it happens that frequently, the extent to which I had to disclose. But there's always that discomfort of knowing the reason you're not disclosing, and that you're in a place where it's not safe to disclose. So not many people have pretended to drink, but there are 20%. So that's always interesting. And we do focus on minorities. And I'm curious if you did drink at a work function, even though you didn't really want to or intend to. And that would be really interesting to know as well. Oops, here we go.
When we consider that there's also situations where people will avoid the disclosure, and so they will either pretend to drink or drink when they don't want to, simply so they do not have to do that disclosure. And I think normalizing it, like you said, would just remove all of that and allow people to engage without that pressure, whether it's in their own mind or not, whether the people would be welcomed or respond kindly, they still don't want to have to disclose their personal information. And here we have a little higher percentage we see of people who drank when they didn't want to.
Yes, and so I can go on and show you the next slide, which is, I'll end the poll, which is that there's data to back this up. This was a recent study in the UK, which they also have a history of workplace drinking. But of the 53% for workplace events said that they'd like to have less pressure to drink. Why aren't you drinking? What are you drinking? Let's go get a drink. And 43% drank more alcohol than they intended. You know, maybe they weren't going to drink, but they went ahead and they did. And many of those did so they wouldn't seem impolite. And 12% pretended to drink. So our percentage in the poll is higher than in this study of those who actually pretend to drink. And, you know, I've seen this colloquially when I talk to people. They're like, oh, but what you can do is get a seltzer and have cranberry in it so that you can be pretending to drink. And I've heard this from leadership, you know, not that we're normalizing to not drink, but to make sure it's easy enough so that people can pretend to drink. And so I've always found that interesting. But what if, you know, so a number of people simply do not drink or pretended to drink because they don't feel comfortable to be authentic. And there's an implicit understanding that you need to have an alcoholic drink to fit in with expectations, to belong, and to have access to leadership. Not always, but with our culture, it's not infrequent. So many non-drinkers can attend work events that center on alcohol, and even if it's not a good fit, because, you know, it's through a physical reason. But what about those who are trying not to drink, or it doesn't align with their values, and they simply may not attend? And that was the situation that I was telling about you for my story. So my reaction was in line with the data. My instinct was to lie, and 22%, and I'm not a liar, and I'm not good at it. But 22% of those who didn't attend made excuses. They didn't feel safe to be authentic and say, I don't feel comfortable or I don't drink. And we know that there can be consequence. They worry about being judged. We worry about being judged if we don't show up. I was worried about offending the director. And so we know that there can be consequences to our careers when we don't attend certain social events, like I did not. I want to share this example of a gentleman who's Muslim, and he wrote about the impact for him in the workplace. And as you can see, it says, I feel as if I might be missing out on important networking opportunities compared to my peers if I'm not attending team social events for religious reasons. And that he feels as if he might be misjudged as unsociable, or that I just don't like the team for not attending the events. But it's not because we're not sociable and don't like our team members. It's because the specific dynamic of focusing on alcohol does not align with our safety and values. So what if organizations created a culture where disclosure is not necessary, to your point, Tanya, and where it's simply normal to not drink, whether it be for a day because you have a deadline or you want to spend time with your kids after you go home, a short period of time for reproductive reasons or health reasons, or permanently, like myself, that I choose abstinence over alcohol. And what would it be like when no one asks you why you're not drinking? Again, because it's just normal. So that leads us to our third objective. And
Hold
that's,
on, before you go to that, I think
sorry,
it's an opportunity to bring it back to the disclosure, as well as, people asking the question, why are you not drinking? And I think it's very aspirational of us to look towards a future where we normalize not drinking. But in the meantime, people are still experiencing this. And so you might have a woman who is not drinking because she is of childbearing years, but then there are assumptions of, oh, she must be pregnant or things like that. And people feeling okay to ask the question, why are you not drinking? So what are ways that people can respond nicely and professionally to questions without disclosing until we get to the point where we normalize not drinking?
Well, what's interesting is that in my sobriety, I learned that very short answers are sufficient. I have another commitment. I'm not drinking tonight. It's really as easy as that. Oh, I'm just not drinking tonight because I have another commitment, or I have something going on that I need to pay attention, I need to do.
And I think it's important too that while we recognize there's this wide spectrum of non-drinkers, there's also the stigma that people may not want to not drink because then there will be this association like, oh, they must have alcohol use disorder, or they might be, and it may be completely different reasons, but now those biases and assumptions are being passed on to them simply because they chose not to drink for reasons outside of that. So thank you so much for bringing those discussions up.
And I think that's part of this awareness, raising the awareness of really the large spectrum of people who don't drink, the different reasons. And so the more educated we are, the less we make assumptions. So this does lead us into our third objective, which I will actually do a little bit shortly, which is pragmatic ways to create inclusive events for non-drinkers. And we know that based on our values, we want to be inclusive with respect to gender, religion, ability, and background. We embrace diversity. We want to be compassionate and respectful. And we want authentic and meaningful relationships. So I'd like to teach you some pragmatic ways to create inclusive events that support non-drinkers and those in recovery. And again, my friend Saiqa, in just a few moments, will be highlighting some issues with that as well. And I wanted to point out that, we just make a start. You don't need to be perfect. is progress, not perfection. Many organizations have already made a lot of progress, but they don't necessarily know the why of DEI connected with it, which really connects with our deep personal and organizational commitments and values. So for organizations, leaders and HR play a key role in making decisions and showing values through action. And to ensure that Saiqa has time, I'm going to go through these fairly quickly, but the first is programming and a budget audit. And Saiqa is going to talk about the budget audit. But my point more is that you can actually sit back and look at your programming. I know that Tanya has mentioned that Incura is going to look at if they provide events that don't have alcohol for the conference, that it's not every single event has alcohol. And are you creating alcohol-free events? Can you focus more on the goal, which is connection and creative experiences? Whether, I know Tanya's actually mentioned this before, about, icebreaker things so that you connect more. You don't need the social lubricant of alcohol because there are facilitated ways to connect. Another point that I want to point out is equity in beverage options and how separate placement can be very helpful, particularly for both normalizing not drinking, but also for people in recovery, because you can imagine that one point of access to get a drink and it has displayed beers, displayed wines, like this is what we're offering. I only have one place to go. When I get up there, you have Coca-Cola products and seltzer water, so it's like, I think I'll have a Diet Coke, or maybe I get to pretend by throwing in a splash of cranberry juice into a seltzer water. And so my point is that pragmatically, we can have a separate alcohol-free spot that has not only the sodas and the seltzer water, but you can actually bring intentionality around like iced teas, flavored things, or mocktails, which I don't like the word mocktail. I would call it, a refreshment. And that makes it so much easier for everyone who wants to choose to not drink at that specific event to just go self-serve, get something. And people are starting to discover that lots of people want that option. And if they're not faced with like option number one, sit there, display beer, wine, I guess I'll get a beer, that they will go directly and use another option. And so I do want to move on. Another quick thing is location, time of day. We talked about how during the day is easier to not have alcohol, but I also wanted to point out program titles and descriptions. Are you hosting a wine tasting? Are you hosting the bowling and brews? Do you, in the description of every event, intentionally talk about how there will be alcohol-free options? Intentionally have it in the description. And so I can move on to the next slide, and what can I do as a person? Because these are both organizational values as well as personal values. And as a person in recovery, I can say, like, can you please exercise just empathy and compassion that I have a disease and I didn't decide to have it. And so to the extent that, we can bring intentionality and not say, should we invite Brooke? Instead say, maybe we can all do something fun, like go on a walk or go bowling without the brews. And so also I'd encourage you to think twice, are we defaulting to drinks after work, and pausing and starting to become aware. And I mean, it may take some intentionality around this, is am I pressuring my colleagues to drink? Saying, why aren't you drinking? I mean, people just naturally say it. I mean, this is just, it's something that's ingrained. So it's not on purpose that you're making, it's not on purpose. But what you can do is encourage your leadership to provide equity and alcohol-free options, and also really seek experience-oriented relationship building, cooking classes, golfing, all sorts of things. You don't have to include alcohol with it. When you're having an experience and connecting with the experience, frequently you don't even think about it. That's my experience with my meetup group of, I don't know, we've had close to like 150 events now. We don't talk about alcohol at all. And we don't talk about recovery from alcoholism because most people aren't in recovery. We just take a hike and connect with each other on the hike. So with that, I'm going to shift over to my colleague Saiqa, who has some really interesting perspectives and data around some options that Incure and other organizations can think about.
Before we jump to Saiqa, I did want to bring one of the questions that came through, which says, has anyone had the experience where a colleague shared with a supervisor their thoughts on your drinking while at a work conference? The supervisor later brought it up in a one-on-one meeting, and how would you handle that situation? I know that's a bit loaded, but if you can maybe talk to that a little bit in terms of, what people do and how they conduct with regards to alcohol can then later be brought to their supervisors, and how one can handle that.
Well, that is exactly what happened to me. Exactly, which is that, I told my supervisor told the director pulled me into her office. And I don't personally have like a perfect solution for that. I actually think that the way that I handled it was pretty professional, which is like, thank you for your generosity, thank you for your leadership. And my suggestion is, XYZ, like, can we focus on experience-oriented things? Like, we didn't have to go do a happy hour. We could have done something fun at the center that, was engagement-oriented, where we'd learn about each other and not just sit at a bar. Or, all of these suggestions of like, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? Unfortunately, the disclosure is out of the bag at that point. But, if we're armed with these different options and suggestions, then I think you can bring it to an educational moment, because again, people don't do it on purpose. It's a matter of growing towards our values.
Do you think it is unacceptable to merely say, I don't drink?
Oh, no, it's certainly acceptable. And I would like it to be normal to not drink. So it's just, I don't drink, or I'm not having a drink tonight. There's so many people that don't drink for lifestyle reasons. More and more, including the members of my meetup group, it's just lifestyle. It's simply lifestyle. So to the extent that we all start to get used to the idea that whether it be lifestyle, newer generations, or any of number of reasons, that we don't have to bring assumptions of, oh, it's because they're in recovery, or oh, she's probably pregnant, or what have you, because our mind shift and our education has shifted. So I think with that, I will pass on to my colleague Saiqa. I'd love to stay connected. If you found this presentation helpful, I'm happy to speak with your organization or consult with you about shifting your culture related to alcohol. And I'm also available if anyone needs to talk about their drinking or drinking for their friends and family. I'm happy to do that. So my Information will be at the end of the presentation, as well as a couple of resources I provided, including the article that I wrote that Tanya discovered, and the one that I cited by Haley Moss, and some other statisticky research stuff. So thank you so much for having me here today. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I just want to give a little bit of feedback before we pass it over to Saiqa. And so already we have had an impact because someone said that they have had the experience of sending a bottle of wine as a professional gift. And now they will switch their gift selection process. So I think that's really wonderful. And people are responding positively to this. So I think our mission of educating and bringing awareness is happening. And so Saiqa, let's talk about the impact and the implications.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Brooke. And this is just such an honor and such a privilege to be here for me as well. So let's go ahead and move to the next slide, and we'll talk a little bit about our learning outcomes and objectives. So for my section here, which will be much briefer, I'm just going to build on what Brooke was talking about. And we want to talk about kind of the nuts and bolts of the effect and the amplified inclusion impact, right? Of centering around alcohol instead of maybe on some of those professional development values. And we're going to use some data to do that. So we want to understand the impact on resource implications. We want to understand the impact on allocation of resources. And we want to talk a little bit about opportunity cost, right? So when we are centering on alcohol, what are we not doing? So the next slide would be great. The implications here, we really want to focus professionally, both at our home institutions and within Cura, on our learning and development goals, right? So part of where I've centered this presentation, and there has been a groundswell, mostly post-COVID, as we've come back together. And there's been some concerns about budgets, which is a big driver of my section here. But we are seeing speakers request to not be scheduled on the final morning. They do not want to be speaking. It's considered a dead space, and they do not want to speak, and I quote, the morning after the night before. And so what we are seeing is low attendance on that final morning. We have data to back this up. We're seeing lower, well, you do see a decline in response rates about feedback about sessions. The decline is precipitous. We're just seeing simply less bums on seats for those sessions, those morning sessions on that final morning. And we are getting some concern and feedback from sponsoring institutions about the value of the final day, because people have been out the night before, and you have to be responsible for you. But if we are using budget to fund alcohol that is stopping us or hindering our progress on our professional development goals, that's a little bit of a different issue. And we want to recenter on our inclusion goals. We, as Brooke had really heavily emphasized and brought up, there's concerns about inclusion at events where alcohol is centered. And then I'm going to talk about budget, and that includes some diversity issues around food and beverage options that are impacted by centering alcohol, and also about opportunity costs with funds that are funding alcohol as well. So next slide, and I believe we have a poll. So we're going to talk about money. What is the percentage increase in price you have seen when dining out? I want you to think pre-COVID and then think about today and think about the percentage of increase. And then we're just going to wait for some results here. And then I'll go through some national averages, and we're going to talk about some food and beverage prices. And we're seeing, we'll wait just another little minute here on responses. But I think many people are seeing an increase in their household budget, maybe when they just go out for dinner, whether or not they consume alcohol, but just their food and beverage prices. So I think we have most of our respondees, and I'm going to share the results. And what we're seeing here, the results we're seeing are primarily in that 15 to 20% zone, with some people in that 20 to 25, and then quite a few in 25 plus. The data I can give you from the restaurant organization, which is the National Restaurant Organization, is that restaurant prices are up about 23% nationally on average. So what that means is you're seeing anywhere between that 15 to 20 all the way up to 25 plus. And then we'll talk about grocery, but grocery bills from February of 2020 to September of 2023 That's the data I could get, went up 25% as well. Again, that's an average, and in some parts of the country, we'll go through this, those prices have increased significantly, significantly more. So next, yeah. So basically, there is an impact on your food and beverage budgets, and I'm talking pre and post-COVID here. So while the booking fee has remained about the same, you see your booking fee there, there's an increase in tip tax and associated fees in many geographies in the country. So we have an example. Our example here is based on $70. $2 of it is the booking fee. And pre-COVID, the tip tax and gratuity was somewhere between $10 and $11 out of your 70. And today it's closer to 18. So what that means is that your food budget has decreased from $57 to $50. This is compounded by food prices going up, which we're going to talk about. So we have less money to spend on food, and food prices have gone up. That's food and beverage as a category. We have 15% on average less to spend. Food prices have gone up at least 25%, and certain items have gone up 50% in cost. Alcohol prices, I'm being 100% honest, have actually remained stable for the most part. So that is one of the few food items, shockingly, that has remained stable. But if everything else goes up and you have less to spend, you still have a real crunch on your budget. Service charges have increased on the alcohol, just like they've increased on everything else. So it's overall, it has gone up, but its individual pricing, for the most part, has not. What we are asking people to do is we are asking those who don't drink, in some cases, to subsidize food and beverage budgets. And I have seen this. I helped with a holiday party. It was an alumni holiday event. And I had, I know Brooke has mentioned the term mocktail, perhaps not being the most popular, but I wanted to do a holiday themed mocktail. We were doing a holiday themed cocktail with wine and beer. And I thought a holiday themed mocktail, Santa's Little Helper. We thought we were set. They had it made. And the price would be the same as the alcoholic drink. And I was shot down by the committee because the argument was they wanted to save money on the non-alcoholic drinks. They didn't want to invest in a mocktail. And so it's become very clear that that is considered a way to save money by having those who don't drink subsidize those who do. So that can be a little bit problematic. So we'll go to the next slide. And I have a couple of slides here about like prices and food changes. So this one is entitled, so it's changes in food prices, but it's from the government account office, and it was under their Sticker Shock Grocery Store Inflation series. And it's from the US Government Accountability Office, USGAO. And this is where, if you look at it, the geography around geographies, the price increases, the thing to sort of take away from this is that your increases in major metropolitan areas are actually higher than in non-major metropolitan areas. And when we have events for Incura and conferences, we tend to locate them in major metropolitan areas for a whole series of reasons around inclusion, ease of access, airports, public transportation. So we think we're making it easier, and we are. But we're then doubly impacted in terms of our food prices because our geographies, if we look at those lists of locations, we have held events in some, if not all of them, in the last couple of years. And so that is also leading to some of the concerns around price increases. And if we just go to the next slide, I do want to talk very specifically. This is a really interesting slide. I want to speak very, very specifically about increases in food prices. So the example I'm going to use, we talk sometimes about food substitution. So one of the things we've considered doing is sort of substituting. So if we think about a Cobb salad, maybe we remove the eggs. Maybe we substitute some of our poultry for, poultry here is one category, but we have maybe less expensive poultry. The only food on this list that the price went down was beef and veal. But I want to highlight that we don't normally provide beef and veal because they are more expensive meat per ounce. So actually that's not saving us money by substituting to beef from chicken or turkey. So if you look at this list, what we're kind of taking away from here is that we are significantly above the historical averages and significantly above even 2021 in many cases. So pork remained stable, beef and veal got cheaper just because there was such an escalation in price, but the price of eggs went up astronomically. And so whilst we do try to food substitute using seasonal vegetables, locally sourced food in order to really manage prices and do some substitution, if all of your food prices are going up across the board, there's not really a way to absorb that pricing, and we're going to have to come up with a slightly different way of doing it. And next slide. I want to talk a little bit about food substitution and how that doubly impacts those who are more likely to also not drink. So if we remember, we think about those who do drink and those who do not drink. So women are slightly less likely to drink, but people from minority backgrounds are less likely to drink. And some of those groups are more highly correlated with maybe religious groups that don't drink or have other dietary needs. So when we substitute food items, particularly for people who for health reasons or lifestyle reasons don't drink, we tend to substitute with calorically dense food that's less expensive. So whilst the seasonal and more readily available can be an equal nutritional substitute, calorically dense is not. So what we're seeing is instead of a selection of muffins where you maybe would have like a blueberry muffin and you'd have like a bran muffin that's maybe low sugar, suitable for those with diabetes, I'm seeing substitutions where instead of those individual muffins, you're substituting with the Entenmann's breakfast loaf, which is a blueberry cake-like substance that's cake-like, and they slice it. So because they're slicing it, it's cheaper. You can also take it instead of 10 slices, you could increase it to 12 slices, you could stretch it out. But for those with diabetes, a bran muffin is an acceptable option, and the Entenmann's breakfast loaf is not. And so we are seeing from the health perspective, people who maybe because of sugars in particular are not eating those foods, or because of cholesterol, high blood pressure, hypertension, they're choosing not to consume alcohol. Some of those food options aren't great choices for them either. And as we crunch down our food choices to save money, we're doubly excluding them. And so they're not getting good food choices, and there's maybe not great options for them to eat. The other thing we do is we may food reduce. So you would reduce the number of meals you offer, so then the onus is on the attendee. So it's basically shrinkflation. So you're attending the conference at the same price point as pre-COVID, but maybe there's fewer meals being offered. They're removing a breakfast or removing a lunch or a dinner. The other one is to reduce courses at meal. So you're choosing between appetizer and dessert. Appetizer, from an inclusion perspective, can have some choices that from people with some health limitations may have better choices, but that doesn't tend to be what happens. They tend to keep dessert. It does tend to be a little bit cheaper. And again, you tend to see choices. They don't have to be calorically dense and sugar focused, but they tend to be, which again causes an inclusion issue for people who maybe don't, that's not a great choice for them. We also see a reduction around drink selection. And as I've mentioned, there's not a mocktail, there's not a nice non-alcoholic option. There's just water. I've seen just water at events for people who do not consume alcohol in order to, I think some of this was budget focused as well to save money. And the reduction of those options does have an impact on those with dietary needs. Next slides. So I do want to talk about actual costs, and I want to focus on those hospitality suites. So hospitality suites are very popular at Incura events. And I know this is going to be potentially a little tricky for some of you to hear, but we're going to go through the math. There's a room fee for those rooms. The drinks are on consumption, and they are $11 to $14 each. And so you can easily be looking at $15,000 to $20,000 spent on hospitality suites during a conference. The non-alcoholic drinks, more like $1 to $3, but they can be $6 with the service fees. That's how the math adds up. And then even house drinks are $8 to $15 a serving. So it is more expensive to be serving alcohol than non-alcoholic drinks. But that is just something to kind of think about.
So Saiqa, before you move on,
of course,
I really like bringing the financial implications of including alcohol at events. And earlier you spoke about our institutions and their investments in our professional development, and our institutions feeling like they're getting less bang for their buck because they are essentially subsidizing alcohol consumption. And then to further that, as it was pointed out by an attendee, that a lot of times alcohol also can create an HR issue. So now not only are institutions forced to deal with the financial implications of it and not getting the professional development that they are investing in, but they're also now having to address HR issues that they would not have to otherwise.
Yes.
Do you want to speak a bit on that?
I do. So there's a couple of HR issues. There's, you pay for someone to attend an event and they are, I mean, you make your own personal life choices. But you need to get up in the morning and you need to attend the conference that's been paid for. So I have personally dealt with program team members who were sent to a conference and couldn't get up the next morning. They missed an entire day of a conference, and we're paying for that. And it is a privilege, an absolute privilege to be invested in for professional development. And then it does become an issue. And the person, I felt sick, I didn't feel well. And then it turns into a whole thing. Like, were they drinking? Did they drink too much? Was it alcohol? Was it jet lag? Like, we're just not quite sure. When there's a pattern of behavior, it can be a problem. We did talk, Brooke touched on sexual assault and alcohol. There is no untold number of stories about women going to conferences and feeling pressure to consume alcohol. Something's in their drink, or something happens. There's miscommunication with a man. He said, she said. These things absolutely happen, and those come home, back to the home institution to be dealt with. So we have incidents where people are not consuming responsibly and possibly not attending. We have people, behavior may be out of line or isn't appropriate. So those are all issues. But as Brooke had also mentioned, there's an HR issue around people, not being a team player for not attending. And it's difficult. Like, I fast for Ramadan, and I will go to a lunch and sit there and I participate not eating, and because I observe Ramadan and that's how I'm going to bring myself. And if a lunch has been scheduled during it, I have no qualms, but I also am very forthright. And I'm also at a different point in my life and my career than when I was younger. And I would be like, oh, I'm just cool, I'm not hungry. Or I'm just cool, I'm not gonna, I'm cool. Don't worry. Because you don't want to bring it to the forefront and get in it's a disclosure issue and a discussion issue around, are you eating? Are you drinking? What are you doing? Why are you doing it? You don't look like that. I didn't realize, oh my goodness. And it can become really tricky. And I know for me personally, for Ramadan, we've done the Ramadan primer and tried to better educate people about faith and its impact. And this is the same sort of thing. Like, what is the impact of how we're spending these dollars? What is the ongoing impact of where the money's going and what it means and what it costs and what are the HR implications? And that is not to say don't drink, but it is to say, when we're paying for alcohol, what are we not paying for? And what is the impact of what we're paying for? It's tricky. So I'm going to go on the final slide. I'm going to talk about the opportunity costs and how they weigh up. But I know that some of the arguments, so we talked a little bit about, opportunity costs, who doesn't attend as they don't feel welcome, who doesn't attend as there's a perception around value for attendance at events. And I think we are seeing institutions really query this more heavily than they have historically. And I know that what I've heard from people when I said I was going to talk about this is, oh, well, it's fine. And Cura's not paying for it besides the hospitality suite. It's a sponsored bar. It's a sponsored bar. The sponsor's paying for it. But have we asked that sponsor to sponsor something else instead? How about that sponsors dessert? How about they sponsor breakfast? How about they sponsor, there's plenty of other things we can ask them. Have we even asked them? There's an assumption by the sponsors that we want an alcohol-driven cocktail hour and bar. They don't have to sponsor that, and we can ask them to sponsor something else, and they may be perfectly willing and happy to do it and just not realize that when we show them the data that potentially 25% of our members don't consume alcohol anyway. So most people eat breakfast. Let's maybe do that instead. Maybe they could sponsor the coffees and teas, and maybe that would be the way to go. what else could we spend the money on? So particularly with those hospitality suites, when we think about who doesn't drink, and the non-Caucasians are more likely to not consume alcohol, right? And we have a bias in Incura where our membership and our working population in our industry does not match the Pew data around who is working in America. And we are overrepresented by the Caucasian population in Incura and in research administration. They're more likely to drink. So when we are creating an environment that is probably even more biased towards that, which is a little tricky when we're trying to be focused on inclusion. So could that money be invested better ways? Could we subsidize membership? Could we subsidize attendance? Could we think about early career, HBCU, PUI, these groups that are underrepresented in our membership? And can we ensure inclusion with other food and beverage choices? So even if we don't do those things, even if we reinvest that money in food and beverage, are there ways of investing it in food and beverage that bring to the fore a way that's more inclusive? And I think it's important to talk about your own experiences here. And I have been very vocal, and I've written, and I have worked with Incura, and I have really extensively worked on this, that the food choices that are made are not always inclusive. There are people who, when you look at the people who are leaving and not eating the lunch, they don't always look like the average member, and it's because there's maybe not an option for them to eat, and it's still proving to be challenging to get over that hurdle. I know budget is a factor, so let's think about how we do that. Let's think about how we do that and the implications, particularly for those where that's not such a good fit. So yeah.
So I think one big question that, because we've talked about all of the reasons why normalizing not drinking would benefit our membership as a whole. But do you think that attendance would radically drop if no alcohol is provided at an Incura function?
No, because it's not that alcohol is not available, and it's not to say that alcohol shouldn't be provided at all. It's about decentering alcohol. I want to be clear. I'm not saying that these should be alcohol. Everything needs to be alcohol free. By no means. What I am suggesting, and what Brooke has brought up, and what I'm really tying back to our budgets and our numbers, is that it seems that the alcohol portion is sacrosanct and can't be touched. It's like in this protected budget category that's like pre-committed spending. And my argument is it needs to come back into the fore. We need to understand what the cost implications are of including it, and we need to evaluate if it is matching our professional development goals and our inclusion goals. If we are spending alcohol in hospitality suites and we are giving people enough alcohol that they are so intoxicated that we are getting feedback that they are not attending the next day's professional development activities, and we have feedback from leadership at multiple institutions that they have concerns about paying for a 3-day event where day 3 seems to be sort of a write-off, I think that that's a real discussion that needs to be had. That's not everybody. That's not all of the people involved. But it is one thing for you to go out drinking on Tuesday night and be worse for wear on Wednesday morning. It's another thing entirely for Incura regions to sponsor hospitality suites and pay for the alcohol, which you imbibe upon to such a degree that we have feedback that people are not attending on Wednesday morning because they've been at the whiskey on Tuesday night, not attending Wednesday morning, and then not engaging in the professional development goals. And we are getting feedback from their managers and supervisors that they have a concern over a 3-day conference. That is not the same as you go for a drink with your friends, or there was alcohol provided and plenty of non-alcoholic options, and you had a drink. There is a large gap between them. But us paying for the drink for you to drink too much and not learn the next day, that's a whole other level. And I think it's one we need to have a real discussion about.
So one of our attendees said, I'd rather have healthy food options and just have a cash bar option if there must be alcohol. And I think it's interesting because that's like an ongoing joke about the food at conferences, right? And sometimes we're not eating the food because there aren't the healthy options that we would prefer, because healthy food options are more expensive. But could we afford those healthier food options if we weren't spending so much money on alcohol? And to your point as well, in terms of our professional development and networking opportunities, that is really what this professional organization is about. and all of our values and our mission are in alignment with that. But then when we see how we're spending our money and such a disproportionate amount of it goes towards alcohol, how much more could we impact our values and our mission if we are diverting those funds towards things like how many more scholarships could we provide, things of that nature. So I really think your connection to the financial implications were very important. And everybody says this was an excellent topic. So I really appreciate all of the research and time that you both put into bringing this topic and the data and the numbers so that we can really have an awareness of just how important this topic is. And we have some more time for some questions. And while we wait to see if we have any more questions from the audience, Brooke, I wanted to bring it back to you because we have a very limited scope based off of our experience in research administration, but you have done research into multiple areas and professions. So have you seen implications either in the positive direction or negative of decentering alcohol at professional events and other professions?
Yeah, so I'm a lawyer. So I'm actually the most familiar with the legal profession. And a positive direction is that the American Bar Association has what's called a well-being pledge. And there's been over 200 law firms and law schools that have signed the pledge. And pledge number 2 is to disrupt the defaulting to alcohol-oriented events or to provide meaningful alternatives. And so what's fantastic is that that is in black and white, and that over 200 organizations have signed on. And so it does exist, and there's increasing awareness. And I did talk to a Muslim leader at my law school who I've been in contact with, and he said in his summer associate this past summer at a big New York law firm that a number of the events were experience oriented. As a matter of fact, he said something about axe throwing, I think. And so that even though there was alcohol there, because they were so focused on the experience, that he still felt included. But I do think that there has been this traditional assumption that we are de-emphasizing alcohol because of the alcoholics. And so that's where I think there's really an opportunity to expand our understanding of the broad impact, broad spectrum, including just simply lifestyle.
So one of our members expressed and seconded that axe throwing experience and stated that they didn't even talk about work. And when we focus and center on the experience, the connection, we find that there are a lot of ways that people can connect and feel safe and included, to the point where you're so absorbed in the activity that you're not thinking about anything else. And so that was a wonderful example. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I think I saw some people actually had hands up, or I see them coming up.
So ultimately, what would be for each of you, if you can answer, if someone had to just take away one thing from this 90 minutes, what would you want them to know?
I think for me, it's really Brooke's data around who doesn't drink, who may not consume alcohol, but also really the concept of inclusion and connecting it to where you spend your money. I do think that connecting together, not just, oh, I want everyone to be included, of course, but it's really where you spend your dollars, and to go back, and no dollar is sacrosanct, no allocated money is sacrosanct, and to really go back and think about it. Because whether it's corporate who's sponsoring it, whether it's a university, whether it's an Incura event, someone is paying for that. It's either being paid through membership or through the event itself, paying for itself, or companies or university sponsoring it. And when you hosted it at a bar, or when you host it at a pub, or when you do those, and you're not meeting your inclusion goal, your money is not, your money has to follow where your mouth is. And if you're saying that those are your goals and priorities, your dollar, your pocketbook has to follow it.
I think I would say to have compassion with yourself as well as with your organization, that you may not have been thinking about this and that your actions don't necessarily align yet with an intentional inclusion of non-drinkers, but that we do have the opportunity, including through pragmatic, how we organize our events, how we budget, to be more inclusive and align with our stated organization and personal values to be inclusive of so many people.
That connects to my personal story of how we got here to this webinar. And I definitely was struggling with, oh my God, I can't believe I never thought about that. And I was feeling so, because I am really a champion for everybody feeling included and everybody having an opportunity to engage and benefit from all that Incura has to offer. And the fact that when somebody brought this up, I realized not once did it cross my mind, because I am a drinker and I do enjoy the social aspects of it. And, it's an opportunity to get away from my day-to-day responsibilities. And it is also a social lubricant for me as well, because it just makes me feel less inhibited about engaging with people that I don't know, or I may have never even spoken to before. And so once I realized that I never thought about this, and I think that's the important work of diversity, equity, and inclusion, is thinking outside of ourselves and considering the experiences that other people who differ from us in whatever capacity, what is that experience like for them? And how can we make it just as enjoyable and inclusive for them as we ourselves experience? And personally, I feel like if I had to forego, we're not advocating take alcohol out, but if that were the case where, alcohol was not included in an experience, for me, I would rather do that and feel that more of my colleagues would show up and we can talk and we can brainstorm and talk about all the issues that we have in research administration and not about the alcohol. And so this was a wonderful webinar, and you both contributed greatly to our education on the topic and our awareness. And I hope all of our members in attendance will continue the dialogue amongst themselves and their teams. And we see here now we have some contact information. So please feel free to reach out to Brooke if you want to discuss even further. She offered her connection as well as these resources, including the article that I read, which made me reach out to her. And also, since Saiqa is one of our very own Incura members, you can also reach out to her to discuss further. And I think that puts us at time. So thank you all for attending and for submitting really thoughtful, wonderful questions and the positive feedback that we received about having this topic on this webinar series. Thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful day.